So let's go into risk management, and risk is multiple things. So if we look at where AI changes, this risk list is the top 10 this month is actually different to the top 10 last month, and is different to the top 10 the month before. AI is changing a lot. So really the biggest risk, PII leakages. And then hallucinations, where AI comes up with an answer. I will deal into the top three in a more detail in the next slides. So let's look at 4 through to 10 a little bit more carefully. Model poisoning. So this is an interesting one, is that there are ways of injecting prompts into your AI agent that can poison the output. So if you've got someone who's malicious, who's got something they want to do to your company, they can work out how you built your system. They can go and inject prompts in that can potentially change your prompt. They can change the way your AI works. They can override controls. So if you don't have separation between your chats, they don't have separation between concerns. If you're not doing good monitoring on your system and you don't have good SOC 2 on your vendors, because you'll need your vendors who are providing those LLMs to actually be able to respond to it and give you why that works or how to prevent that mod poisoning, it will affect the way you work. And because if you're using AI for a front-facing, client-facing, high-value initiative, model poisoning is very dangerous to you. Data drift is sort of another one where your data, what you're trying to do, drifts away. So when you're doing agile scrums, you get natural drift in the process and what you're delivering. In data, you get drifts when you're using data in AI LLMs because it's not using canonical models, it's using kind of assumption models and probability models. Things drift away from where you're going. So make sure that you understand how the data that you're using is going to drift if you're using multiple agents to actually process that data. Biases of your LLM is also another one, is make sure your LLM is well trained. One thing that's come out that the data world is finding out is that LLMs are trained on a corpus of public data and documents. They went to all these websites to pull up. Data people don't write many documentation. You got Inman and Kimball, who have both put extensive writing about it. You got the DM Bach. But if you look at data books, there are very few web articles, web subjects about data out there. So when LLMs were built, there is a weakness in data modeling within the LLMs. I think some of that's been addressed now, but one of the calls that came out 2 years ago from some of the data leads is data people need to write more stuff and write more blog articles now, because we realize there's a gap in the LLMs when it comes to data. And because it's a gap and because it's not an extensively used subject area, it's also lots of incorrect. So bad opinion is making its way through as consensus. So make sure you understand what your model was trained on, where those biases are likely to be, and make sure that you are actually being fair and using that in a fair way. Cost overruns. Again, when you use AI, costs can excel. Make sure you've got controls in place. Vendor lock-in, again, is another risk, but again, you're going to have to choose one camp to go with, but make sure you've got ways of switching between those camps. Regulations are going to change. We know that's going to happen. Again, it's a risk to how we do it. And then skills gap, we can mitigate that by training. So let's look at the top 3 in more detail, though. So really the first one is PII leak. This is really which is going to affect you heavily. If you leak out sensitive data of your clients into an LLM and it gets managed to get discovered elsewhere, or it gets pushed out or found, you have a massive leak risk. So you're going to have to disclose. And so that is an impact to your system. Make sure your PII is known, what documents are sensitive. This is where your AI policy, your visibility, your monitoring all come into place. Make sure you know where your PII is. Hallucination control. Again, hallucinations are, I think, are getting less now, but they still have that capability. Hallucinations arise from poor prompting, from poor setting the guidelines of what you're trying to do, or asking a fringe question where the data is not good. So I have a series of prompts that I look for where I'm using various ways of putting controls in place. So I ask every single thing you present has to have a URL reference. So you need to search the web for verification of what you've just said. And give me that reference, give me why you use those pages to verify what you've just told me. And then only then do I want the answer. So every fact you present must be justified, verified, and have the reference and the fact basis attached to it. It takes longer, uses way more context tokens, but it gives you a more short answer. So again, it's a way
But
of minimizing your hallucinations.
I think there's a danger there as well. You can have references that actually back what the LLM is saying, but there can also be
Mm.
references which do not back what LLM is
Yeah,
saying. So there's a bias there, right? So
there's a potential bias, but one thing you can actually do is ask for it to give you opposing cases. So there are ways of saying, give me 3 or 4 opinions about this fact. Tell me why it's true, why it's wrong, and what. Tell me where it's wrong, where it's true. So there are various ways of prompting in that system. So I have about 4 or 5 paragraphs that sort of cover the bias, the referencing, the verification, the fact checking, the asking questions. So if the AI doesn't understand, ask it to ask questions and give it some concrete examples. So some prompts can be very, very large when you're actually building them out. There's some very good articles out there. So if you look at, where is it? Simon Wardley has some interesting takes on AI, but not necessarily how to actually do the prompts. But there's some very good people on LinkedIn who do good prompting, and the names are forgetting me, unfortunately, at the moment. But there's a lot of very good guidance on how you set the prompts up for success. The Salesforce Agentforce information has that information in there as well. So it's sort of giving you a way of checking and making sure you can do what you want to do. Um, so yeah, it
in
is a
terms of
risk. You have to be aware of
in
it.
in terms of managing bias, do you have any favorites between the frontier LLMs, like for example, ChatGPT? It's like OpenAI or Claude or
Um, that's a good question, actually, because I find that the biases and hallucinations come differently in different
yeah.
engines. They also come in the way you treat them as well. So there is you've probably seen the article that was posted last week by, how was it, the guy from Google, who is saying that AI performs better when you threaten it with violence um, than if you actually be nasty to it and you get better responses. I find that's not the case. I've got one LLM, one chat history trained in such a way that the LLM will not answer me unless I've done work for it in the first place. So it actually verifies and said, you said you'll do X. Can you show me and demonstrate you've done X? If you haven't done X, I'm not going to give you the answer to what you want to do. And so it's a very interesting that I got it to actually be not combative, but it's more like a counselor mentor that's actually a gate to me doing more work on a particular subject until I've completed the previous work. And it took probably about 3 months for that behavior to emerge in that chat project. And so I find with things like Claude and ChatGPT, Claude has projects, and those projects are separate context entities. So you can train a project with different personalities. So you can almost have a project that has a personality set to it. And that's pretty good. So you've got it. So you can have an aggressive one, you can have a passive one, you can have a supportive one. You can train it over time in that project to become the kind of personality you want it to be. For ChatGPT, I find that training, it bleeds. Projects aren't self-contained. Context is not contained in a project. It doesn't seem to be. So if I ask a question, it will draw from other projects and answer based on my other projects. So
Yeah.
when I'm trying to get isolation, ChatGPT is not as good at isolation as Claude is. But then there are certain cases where Claude actually seems to go into other projects and they'll pull up these answers like, where the heck did that come from? And then you realize it's read into a different project and pulled information from that project to apply to that particular use case. So again, you have to be aware of how you set up and use these systems
Yeah,
and what is the
I
overall control. And
same. I have a similar observation, but with OpenAI, like you have to be very explicit to tell it to not be context aware and actually start a new context, and in that case, it actually does that. And similar for
well, I found the
Gemini,
context,
whenever.
yeah, I found the context windows are good, but they are still some bleeding happen between context windows if you're using the same account. So there is some other context somewhere in that system, which is not in our control for the chat bots anyway. But if you're using the LLM yourself natively and you're doing the AI API control, that seems to have the context separation. I haven't seen any bleed on that context separation yet. But again, it's only, again, as they release new versions, they seem to change. So as new versions come out, the way they operate seems to change a little bit. So there have been subtle changes in the way it responds. Um, Again, that's another control you have to have in place.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last one is prompt injection, is validate how you actually do your prompts, how you validate them. So again, if you're using something like Teams as your interface into the system, you can put controls in your Teams to actually check what's getting uploaded. So the bot, you can actually write in such a way which goes to a webhook. You can check, is there any API in that webhook or in that prompt, and then reject the prompt straight away before it hits your LLM. So there are ways you can build, if you put an interface between you and the chat, you can control your PII and your prompt injection far more effectively. So yes. So let's go on to the risk management. When you're doing your vendors, when you're selecting your vendors, so just check, here we are, good. So vendor risk assessment. So when we're doing AI, you're going to use vendors to help you out. You want to understand various things from that vendor. So check for what they have SOC 2, where the data lives, what they are, where's the sovereignty of the data. You want to have, do you have an opt-out for model training? So is your data going to be used to train models? What is the SLA? How often is this model going to be up? And if you anything, is there any way of handling healthcare? If you are sensitive to healthcare data and HIPAA, you need to make sure that the LLM you're using is controlled in such a way. So the key questions are data residency, data retention, model training, and certifications. As long as you get those answers and they're favorable, then the vendor is a good one to keep progressing with. So how do you go about selecting your vendor? So the vendor selection process is lengthy, unfortunately. Some companies seem to stick a finger up in the air saying we have a problem. They go and get a vendor, and within 24 hours, they're using that vendor. It is so much easier now to buy product online with a credit card than it used to be. And 20, 30 years ago, vendor selection had a vendor selection tool or a company division inside the organization. You say, we wanted to use this vendor, or we want a vendor to do X. They'll go out and find vendors for you, and they'll do RFIs and various things. I would be diligent when you're using vendors for AI. Their scope, their approach is going to affect the way you work in an organization. So make sure you understand the types and levels of how you do the vendor. So what I've done here is try to put together a very over bureaucratic way of selecting vendor. As you notice, it's a 6 months, 5-month process to select the vendor properly. But that's including doing a POC and an MVP and having the vendor actually proving that their tool works and then doing a proper RFP and actually choosing a vendor to support you in the future. So it's worth doing if you're going to use this vendor to drive your work. If there's SI for you, make sure you go through the due diligence, prove they can do the work, prove they support you, prove that you can work with them. And this is what this slide is trying to do.